communism must be opposed. My father was imprisoned for 17 years. So was my grandfather on the mother's side and my grandmother. Everybody was at a certain moment, they were all imprisoned. It was a miracle that he came out alive. Even after being released from the prison, my father was all the time followed and persecuted. This is some kind of an organized sin, a system of organized sin. Like you speak of organized crime. Many people died. It was an extermination prison, Râmnicu Săran. So the rate of survival, I think it was 10% or something. The aim was at that time to really behead the society, to remove from circulation any possible leader, people that could become, model or lead others. Everything that is now blamed on the Western civilization was invented in.
Everyone, welcome to another episode of the AD Show. We have with us a very special guest from Romania, Dr. Anca Cernea. Welcome to the show, Dr. Cernea.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
You had a family history that was affected by one of the biggest, if not the biggest, man-made cancer that the humanity invented, communism. And communism is something that never goes away. It's kind of like an ongoing fight of our lives. It keeps coming back, just changes faces every now and then, but it keeps coming back. And sometimes it wins. First of all, introduce you to the audience. Tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, your background a little bit.
By the family background, I am the daughter of a Christian political leader. My father used to be the leader of the students of a very popular political party in Romania during the Second World War and a little bit after the Second World War, until in fact Romania was occupied by the Soviets, by the Russians, and every independent political activity was forbidden. Because of his leadership, because of his fight for liberty, for human rights, my father was imprisoned for 17 years. And my mother also was imprisoned. At that time, my parents were engaged to marry, but they were not yet married. And then my mother was imprisoned for a shorter time. So was my grandfather on the mother's side and my grandmother on the mother's side. Everybody was at a certain moment, they were all imprisoned. My father stayed in prison the longest, 17 years. And then when he came out, we think it was a miracle that he came out alive. And then my parents could get married. And then I came, and then later on, a year later, my younger sister. Well, so our childhood was, we thought it was a happy childhood, because at that time we didn't feel the pressure that my parents were under all the time, constantly. Even after being released from the prison, my father was all the time, followed and persecuted by the secret communist secret police. And so was my mother, to different degrees, all of the members of the family. Well, we grew up. We studied. I studied medicine. I'm a doctor. I'm a physician, general practitioner. My sister is a veterinarian. Now, after 89, my father was still alive, and he became the vice president of the National Peasant Party, which was a very important anti-communist force in Romania in the 90s. He became the vice president. He also got elected as a senator. He was a member of the Romanian Senate for a short time. And well, he left us in 2001. He passed away because of a cancer that had a lot to do with the things that he had suffered in prison. Well, that's more or less introduction. I would also add that we belong to the Greek Catholic Church. Our church was completely forbidden during the communist regime. And our bishops, there were 12 bishops, they were all imprisoned, and many of them died in prison. 7 of them died in prison. None of them accepted to cooperate with the regime. So also on this level, we belong to this very strong anti-communist tradition. It's not only for political reasons, for our attachment to freedom, but also for very deep religious beliefs. We think that communism must be opposed. I also had the chance to represent the Catholic doctors from Romania, from Bucharest actually, in the Vatican Synod of 2015. I was allowed to be an auditor in the Synod. And I gave the message of our community in the sense that we wanted a stronger opposition on behalf of Rome with regard to cultural Marxism, with regard of this Marxist infiltration all over the culture, especially in the West, and particularly we are concerned about some developments in the Catholic Church.
I'm gonna start like with the last thing that you said. From outside looking in, obviously I'm not a member of the Catholic Church, but I see a lot of left wing, if not communist influences of the Catholic Church, especially the Latin American churches. They seem to be very well deep ingrained with with communist beliefs. What is the current state of the Catholic Church, and how can the people of faith fight back to this communism? Because if communism, it's infiltrating the church, what's left of the faith?
Try to answer your question by coming back to my experience in the synod, because that was a very interesting experience, very direct contact with people from all over the planet, representatives of the church, also laymen, as well of course as bishops. I was worried, when I left for Rome, because we were very concerned about things that had happened a year before, in 2014, the first part of the Synod on the Family. I was aware that all of these attacks would continue, and I was going to face this kind of problems. But my faith in the church came back strengthened, because even if the Pope, I'm not sure that he's a communist. I think he is not aware of the evil of communism and the degree to which the Catholic Church in South America has been manipulated by the communists and by Russian agents. So I don't think the Pope is the source of all this situation. But even if he was, it's impossible for a pope to destroy the church, even if he wants to. And I don't think, the current pope really wants to destroy the church. He does things that are disruptive, but, only God knows the intentions. Anyway, my impression was that there's such a strength in the church. If you see, like, for instance, the Nigerian bishops and most African bishops who come even from Latin America, from countries where there is persecution against the church, for instance, Venezuela. These people really are Christians, and they are ready to die for Christ. It's exactly the same mindset that probably animated our bishops. They were ready to die for Christ, and they were even, smiling at this idea. One of the Nigerian bishops was surprised by some depressed statements made by Western bishops. Well, the church is, losing faithful. The church has been discredited by some scandals. The church is now trying to recover the lost sheep and things like this. And he said, look, in our country, we are very happy to serve Christ. And yes, some of us are being killed. Okay, and they are with the Lord. They are safe. There is no problem. And if you don't get killed, then you should be thankful that you're still alive. And why is that you guys seem so depressed? There is no reason to be depressed. This direct contact with living church in other countries is strengthening, really. So it's not something that happens through the media or through other people's impressions or memories. And you talk directly to those people, and you see how they live their faith. So I'm not worried for the church, because you see, the church is not only a human institution. And this is also valid for the Orthodox Church. The church, in the theological sense, includes also the saints, those who have preceded us and now they are in heaven. And, so all of these components, make the church. And the church is a divine institution, I mean, divine and human. It was founded by Jesus Christ, and it has this advantage that no matter what sins and what stupid things we do as humans, the leadership is in the hands of God. Actually, yes, it is a problem. Let's compare it with the situation of pastors and sheep and wolves. If the shepherd is no longer able to recognize the threats and to warn and to protect the flock against them, then really a lot of the sheep are going to get lost. It's a great responsibility. Communism is, if we come back to communism, this is not only an ideological or economical or political problem. It's deeper than that. It's a spiritual problem. So it does belong to the job description of the shepherds. So they should be the first to recognize this kind of threat. I'm talking about this famous fragment of Saint Paul's letter to the Ephesians, where he says that actually, well, I'm saying it with my words because I don't know by heart the English version. So he says that we are actually not fighting blood and flesh. It's not the matter that we fight. We are fighting against the powers of the evil one. So it's a spiritual struggle. It's not only material. Okay, so this thing, I think, should be better understood, and we should come back normal situation where the shepherds recognize this is a theological problem, first of all, communism, Marxism. Now, since that time, so it's already 10 years ago, my experience with the synod. At that moment, there was an appearance that you could rely on some alliances. There were people also from Western countries, Catholic, who were still attached to the traditional teaching of the church, especially to the moral teaching. And they had nice, big families, and very intense prayer practice and prayer life, and we counted on them, and we thought they were allies. But unfortunately, now there is also a problem on that part of the church, because of the Russian strategy to infiltrate now the conservatives of all faiths, not only for the Catholics, but there is a special offer. Let's say Russian propaganda has special interest in taking over the conservatives. And then we have a big problem, because they adopt all of the Russian agenda, all of the Russian talking points. And now, especially since the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which is a neighboring country, we have the longest border with Ukraine from all of Ukraine's neighbors. We feel their pain, and we are grateful for their courage and for their dedication to defend civilization. And we are absolutely appalled. We are shocked to see how many of our conservative friends, especially Catholic conservatives are now supporting the aggressor. They support Russia against Ukraine. In Ukraine, there is a very big Catholic Church, at least 5 million Greek Catholic Ukrainians, and they have very good bishops. And for instance, in the synod where I was, there were very, very powerful voices in favor of, defending the normal Catholic teaching. So you cannot describe them as progressivists or neo-Marxists. That would be absolutely absurd, But nobody seems to even taking to account what they have to say about what's happening now to Ukraine. So this is an additional problem. So it's cultural Marxism, as you say, it's deep and it is very, very worrisome. But on the other hand, those of the Catholics who used to be for us the hope for the future of the church now seem to be the most terrible enemies we have. They want us dead. It's very simply said. Because if Ukraine falls, we are the next. That's obvious. So it's going to be the same, and the same situation that my parents had to face almost a century ago, 80 years ago. Now it's going to be, our destiny in the 21st century. If things really go the way our Catholic brothers and sisters would like them to.
Dr. Cherna, I want to go a little deeper, right? What is the mechanism, more or less visible, or maybe it's like totally invisible? How do the Russian propaganda infiltrates the church in such a way that influences like minds, basically influences minds, and it does like a 180 for a lot of the a lot of the people of that's supposed to be of faith. What are the mechanisms? How do they succeed?
Look, I think that there are books about this, and I hope I am able to at least to give an idea about the mechanism. It's very, very complicated, very sophisticated, and it's a very, very old operation. Actually, if we go further in history, even further before communism, we find in the middle of the 19th century, there was a letter by a Polish aristocrat, a Polish writer, Krasiński. He wrote a letter to Napoleon III, the Emperor of France. And he was describing Russia. If you didn't know who wrote it and when, you could say that it was written, 3 years ago. It's so valid right now still. And he explains there, of course, the emperor didn't understand anything of it, but he was explaining that Russia has extraordinary ability to infiltrate and to influence, to infiltrate spies and to influence the politics in other countries. Well, also other empires and other kingdoms have used intelligence, it's something that you would expect. They have armies, they have intelligence, but it's completely out of proportion. I mean, Russia and China and countries from the East, they put a lot more accent on this kind of activities than other normal, let's say, empires. So the West is completely unprepared to even to look for this kind of infiltration, because I can't imagine that some people would really put so much money and so much effort into these kind of things. So let's now talk about communism. Communism by itself, from the beginning, from the first writings of Marx and Engels, it is satanic. This is a very important thing to know, and it's not an exaggeration. There have been also books about it. For instance, I would recommend, because it is very simple to read and very, very seriously documented, a book by Richard Wurmbrand, who was an evangelical pastor in Romania, and he was in prison for very long years, for 14 years. My father has met him in prison, and he said that he was really a Christian hero, a Pastor Wurmbrand. And he made some research. He was even surprised, himself was surprised, because he didn't expect that much overwhelming evidence about the satanic character of communism. And we also know that in his youth, Marx used to write poems, satanic poems. They are satanic, and if you study the wording and the way he builds all this the structure of the poems, it looks like he was in contact with some satanic circles, because he uses symbols and things that are familiar to Satanists. That is why we should regard this as a religious problem, first of all. Marxism is a religion, and it has its, sacred writings, it has prophets, it has an inquisition, very, very harsh, incomparable to the, Spanish Inquisition, which was a dark page in Catholic Church's history. And then they have a religious calendar, that there are religious processions and ceremonies. So it's like a religion, but it is mocked. It is the other way around. It's turned upside down. Also, if you compare it with a cult, especially in the first decades of the Soviet Union, they tried to convince others and to bring new faithful into the cult. And one of the things first things that were done by Lenin in the first days of the Soviet Russia, let's put it like this: there are two main ways through which communism was spread in the world. The one was by very brutal military means. And that was done, for instance, they attempted to do this. And there was this war with Poland, and thanks be to God, they couldn't win that war. But actually, later on, after the Second World War, they were able to occupy militarily half of Europe. That was the brutal means. And there was also another kind of infiltration, which was meant to undermine the moral and cultural base of the Western civilization. And that was done first by the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School was founded by Comintern, but personally by Lenin and by Georg Lukács, the Hungarian communist, let's say, philosopher. And then the Frankfurt School also had this purpose to serve communism, but it was not declared, So the job was only to destroy, to undermine, to criticize, to expose. It was not explicit, the fact that what they wanted was to bring up more about the communist society. On the other hand, at the same time, there was another strategy taking place, which was described by Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian communist. Antonio Gramsci was, let's say, parallel to the Frankfurt School. He didn't belong to the Frankfurt School. There was no contact. But Gramsci said explicitly that the purpose was to bring about a communist society. But he said that you should obtain this by small gradual changes. So people don't realize how it happens, and one day they will just wake up in a communist society, and without quite realizing how they got there. That was Gramsci's strategy. And it was long term. And Gramsci also said that we should not directly rely on open propaganda. So we shouldn't use uniforms and very very clear slogans. Like people who don't really understand what they are doing, like for instance actors or sportsmen, and they just give a part of the message, and some other actor or sportsman, some celebrity, people who don't have really complete education, they are not profoundly intelligent or prepared, but they think it's okay. And let's say they, for instance, they want peace and they want the West to disarm during the Cold War. They fight for the rights of Palestinians, and this is things that sound okay at the first sight. Actually, they carry some kind of a virus, but this virus is being brought piece by piece. So, if you are not aware of what's going on, if you didn't study all those things, you don't realize how it works. Now, one of the most important things that Gramsci taught was that the church must be infiltrated, the church, the Catholic Church, because he considered, and probably he was right, that this was the institution, the most powerful, the strongest opposition, institutional opposition against communism, because communism was already condemned by the church. At that time, that was no hesitation. I mean, the popes at the beginning of the 20th century and also in the 19th century had repeatedly condemned these ideas. So Gramsci was right to think that the church was the enemy, and the solution that he proposed was to infiltrate the church, and then also to infiltrate the media, the art, the culture. We needed writers, especially cinema. So from all the arts, he saw that cinema is um, most efficient because has a lot more impact than books. Books, of course, also, but people read less books. But they prefer to see movies. So movies are very important, and we know how it was organized in Hollywood. Hollywood was a center of communist propaganda. It was investigated, but communism proved to be stronger. And those who investigated communism in Hollywood were now, in the most of history textbooks are considered witch hunters, and the blame is on them, not on the communists. And
Joe, Joe Macari finished in a
Democrat,
in a terrible way. His life was ruined by this. I mean, he
yes,
was the one that went after the communists in Hollywood, and then
exactly.
he ended up miserably, and he died miserably, to my knowledge.
Yes, and well, so it was a strange death. Even the death was rather surprising. But yes, there are many, many suspicious details about his death. And anyway, even after his death, he's still being, slandered and attacked. It's a sign that he was onto something, because if these guys still consider him as an enemy, then it means that he was right. Now, there are many people who criticize the West for its decadence, for its, that there's less attachment to the Ten Commandments, less religious attendance, and so on. But if we really follow this thread of the communist infiltration, we see that a lot of these, I think most of these developments, are not spontaneous. It doesn't mean that the West is paradise and it was absolutely perfect if there was no communism. Of course, because it's a pluralist society, there are many, many trends, and some of them are destructive, some of them are constructive. But what really makes the greatness of the Western civilization, everything that really makes this greatness comes from Christianity. That is something that is just a question of intellectual honesty to admit this. So even if someone is an atheist, or I don't know, has another religious belief. It doesn't matter. It's not a matter of religious denomination. It's a fact. So, by destroying Christianity, by infiltrating it, by making it, look more like a humanitarian NGO, the church, instead of what's supposed to be a, spiritual leadership, then you disarm Christianity and you remove the faith from people's lives, and then this can open the way for communism or for any other kind of ideological, human-made political religion.
It's very interesting that you did say. I was about to ask you if you see communism as a religion, because I'm of the
Yes,
same opinion.
definitely, definitely.
They
Yes,
have all the signs that a religion that identifies with. Um,
exactly. Yes, all the attributes. They try to mock them, to imitate them. There is a Polish author who has written a book about the Fatima apparitions. There was a prophecy in Fatima about Russia's errors. It was in 1917. And the prophecy was that Russia was going to spread its errors all around the world. And this was going to cause wars and persecutions against the church. And this Polish author follows the first things that the Soviets did in Russia when they came to power. They implemented some kind of a reverse Ten Commandments. So each one of the Ten Commandments was inverted, and there were laws, to establish these inversions. And he said this is some kind of an organized sin, a system of organized sin. Like you speak of organized crime, when we speak of mafias or, I don't know, terror networks, uh, we speak of organized crime. And I think it's a good idea, I mean, to put things in these terms. Organized sin. So it's a system that makes it very difficult for you to survive as a decent person, because everything around you is made to force you to sin. To, for instance, to betray your friends or your family, to lie, because if you don't lie, if you don't, accept the public lie, then they are going to come after you. Everything step by step. I mean, all of the Ten Commandments were being fought by the legislation of the Soviet Russia, even in terms of morality, because they legalized prostitution, they legalized abortion, they legalized a simplified, very much divorce. That divorce was more than simple. You just had to write a postcard and to send it to some official institution. You didn't even have to inform your spouse that you were divorcing. So everything that is now blamed on the Western civilization was invented in Russia in the 20s. Everything, including euthanasia, everything. So I think that it is important to know how much of this comes from Russia. And then when Russia nowadays pretends to bring salvation from this Western decadence. And Putin goes to church and he sings in church, and we see him with a candle in his hand. And many, my fellow Catholics from the United States think that he's a new emperor, the new Christian, Constantine, who's going to save us from cultural Marxism. They should keep in mind that this is a communist guy. He comes from KGB. Nobody even knows how many children he has with how many wives, or I don't know, wives or mistresses. So this is everything that has to do with Russia is built on a lie. And people should be aware of the fact that they are being manipulated, either by the right hand or by the left hand. I mean, both strategies are being used. There is a famous scissors strategy. the most important ideologue, propagandist of the current Russian regime is Alexander Dugin. And Dugin in the 90s, by the end of the 90s, 99 or some 99, I think he gave an interview to a Polish magazine, and he said there that we need to destroy the West by hitting it both from the left and from the right. So this is a strategy, and you push your agents in the left hand, let's say in America, to exaggerate with the claims that, I don't know, climate change, LGBT, sex change operations in minor children without the agreement of even information of their parents. So you push all this agenda in order to exasperate normal people. And then you have prepared for them in case they want to do something, then you have to offer them an alternative, and you offer them an alternative that is pro-Russian in the right side. So we have now in the Trump administration a lot of pro-Russians. So people voted for Trump because they thought he was conservative, and then they brought an administration which is so overwhelmingly pro-Russian. This is a very dangerous situation.
Whom are you most concerned with the most from all the people surrounding the president?
First of all, I'm concerned about Vice President Vance because of the hierarchical positions. But there is also this. I'm very concerned about Tulsi Gabbard because, as I said, for the Russians and Chinese, this is a very, very important part of their strategy to work through infiltration and through, agents of all kinds, and they are experts in infiltration and influencing. So it is of critical importance to have somebody reliable coordinating the different intelligent agency intelligence. We are very, very worried about what's going on. There are many things that you can find in the media that probably happen behind the scenes. But let's just take the official statements. All of these things that are being said against Ukraine and all of these friendly gestures made towards Russia. And the fact that America is now negotiating peace in Ukraine without Ukraine. So the talks are directly between the US and Russia. This is really for us a reason of vital risk.
Very, very interesting perspective, and really thank you for sharing. Living in the United States for the past 22 plus years, obviously I can see things like you see them. You're like so close right there to the war zone. Is literally within striking distance, I should say. Thank you for doing that. I do want to go back to your father. How old was he when he was arrested?
He was first arrested in 46. He was born in 1918, so he was 38.
38 years old. And what
Yes.
was the accusation? What was he accused of?
Oh, trying to overthrow the government, something like this. High treason, something very serious. He was released for a time, then he tried to hide, but they found him and he was arrested again. And he stayed in prison for a total of 17 years. And during that time, there was practically no contact with the outer world. And my mother didn't even know if he was still alive. There were some rumors, some people who went out of prison and they had heard that he was dead. For a time, she wore black garments. She really thought he was dead. Then there was another rumor that no, he was seriously ill, but he wasn't dead. Things like this. So it's hard to describe for Americans how the situation was in a communist prison and what the Russians really brought to Romania, because it was completely foreign to our ways. It was a completely unlawful regime, and the aim was at that time to really behead the society, to remove from circulation any possible leader, all people that could become, model or lead others into some kind of an opposition against this regime. So they arrested all the political leaders, they arrested the military commanders, all of the bishops of both churches, I mean the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, those who didn't accept to cooperate, because in the Orthodox Church, unfortunately, they found some bishops that agreed to cooperate. But the patriarch, the patriarch died in very suspicious circumstances. And then his successor also died. His most likely successor also died in suspicious circumstances. So we may one day find out that they were martyrs too. They could have been murdered, because these kind of things also happen. And Romania came to a point in which one person in eight was either in prison or deported or taken to Russia. So it was such a pressure over society in general, because everybody had some relative or some neighbor or some friend or some colleague who was taken. So my father said that for those who were inside of prison, he thought that the pressure and the terror was more terrible outside, because those who were left outside of the prison were fearing for the dear ones that were imprisoned, and they didn't know what was going to happen to them, to themselves. So my father said that in prison anyway, you were prepared to die anytime. So it was, he says that he imagined that for my mother who was waiting for him, the situation was much more difficult to bear.
How did your father make it through 17 years of hard prison? What helped him survive?
It was faith, first of all. It was faith. He had a strong faith, and he was a strong man even in physical terms. Of course, his health was ruined by the prison. 2 years later, after his death, we could have access to the files the Securitate was keeping on him. When President Băsescu was elected, he imposed the archives of the secret services. He forced them to give us access to the files. And then I could see, for instance, that there are some notes from different prisons, because he was moved from one prison to another in different moments of his detention. And there are many notes that he had a very good morale, and he was encouraging the others. He made speeches, he was talking to the other inmates, and he was telling them that, well, communism couldn't last for eternity, that one day it was going to be defeated, things like this. So they were surprised that he was so optimistic. I'm not sure really now if I'm to tell the whole truth. I'm not absolutely sure that he was all the time optimistic, but I think he had this responsibility. He thought that the others are weaker, and he had to encourage them, and he didn't show. Maybe he had his doubts. I don't know. He never spoke about doubts, and there is no trace of any doubt in the documents. There is a lot of record about his resistance, because they say from time to time that there is such an assessment that this individual is really an enemy of our regime. He's still the same. He has the same hostility. You cannot trust him. So they treat him as an enemy until late in 1989. So before Ceausescu fell, there are still records about him being an enemy of the communist regime.
Did he share with you what was life like in prison for him?
Oh yes, we knew about the prisons, they were talking in our presence, and all of the friends of our family were former political prisoners, and many of our relatives. So we were used to having guests, in our house. Our parents had guests. They were talking about prison all the time. Just detailed. My sister used to think that everybody goes to prison at one moment in your life. So you end your studies, and then you go to prison, and then when you come back, maybe you get married or so. Because everybody around us, all of the family, friends, were former political prisoners, and she saw that, well, this is how life goes on. At a certain moment, you go to prison. And well, they were telling there were different kinds of prisons. So there were some were extremely crowded, like Jilava and Ayud. So incredible number of people were, put together in a small room with very little air. It was, impossible to breathe, impossible to move. And in other prisons, you were isolated, like in Râmnicu Sărat. I think it was the most terrible experience my father has been through. And he was there for 5 years. He was completely isolated. And in Râmnicu Sărat, they were not allowed to speak, to hear their own voice. So all of the prisoners were in separate cells, and they were not allowed to speak, and not even to speak to themselves. I mean, to speak loud. That was something meant to destroy them mentally, to make them go mad. And in that prison, well, my father had been a war veteran. He had been fighting in World War II, and he knew Morse's alphabet, so he was able to communicate with other people who knew this way of communication. Not all of them knew, but there were former officers, some people who had been doing their military service, and those who were able to communicate in Râmnicu Sărat like this. The guards, of course, realized that there was some kind of communication, and then it was forbidden. And then they started to communicate by coughing in Morses. And then they got even more sophisticated, and they were coughing in Morses in French, because the guards had brought some experts, from telecommunications from the army, to try to decipher what they were saying. So they communicated in French. Every time that they were caught doing something that was forbidden, and everything was practically forbidden, then they were punished. And it was a terrible thing, because, for instance, it was extremely cold in winter. And then suddenly one guard came with some water and threw it on your bed. So you had to sleep in a bed that was wet in January, when outside the temperature was minus 10, minus 15 Celsius. It was really not a joke. And many, many people died. It was an extermination prison, Râmnicu Sărat. So the rate of survival, I think it was 10% or something. And my father did make it. And also my grandfather was in Râmnicu Sărat. My maternal grandfather was also in prison there for 3 years, I think. He also made it. But that was really meant to kill the people who were there. It was for selection of political leaders who was the selection was made according to this criteria. The people who didn't give up, I mean, they didn't accept to sign anything, to the smallest compromise, and they consider these people as unable to be re-educated, and they put them in Râmnicu Sărat to kill them. That was more or less an example of how things were happening in prison.
What year did he get out of prison?
1964. 64.
1964.
Yes.
The communist regime, does not forgive, does not forget. Securitatea, I believe, he was followed You
He
shared
was
with me.
followed, yes, and I could find. It's a terrible thing to see your father's life in reverse, like from the devil's perspective. How they were planning to destroy him, to try this and that. For instance, when he came out of prison, his health was ruined, and for some time, my mother and the rest of the family was really fearing for his life. He had two very difficult stomach operation because his stomach was suffering because of the hunger in prison, and then it was very difficult for him to find a job. And if you see the files from the Securitate, you see that it was coordinated. So that there were, papers made by officers who were saying you should be careful that Barbush doesn't find any job. So make sure that he doesn't get employed. And on the other hand, for my father, it was a terrible situation because he already was married, and I was born 1 year later, my sister 2 years later. So he had a family and he was unable to get a job. And that was a terrible situation because also for these people who were in prison, it was not the first problem, but there was also this problem of material poverty because the communist regime made sure that they didn't have resources. They live from one day to the other. For instance, my parents could give private lessons. My mother was a teacher of foreign languages. My
Tutoring,
father
right?
also, yes,
They were
yes.
tutoring.
So this was a resource. They could make a little money by doing this. My mother made some private translations, people who needed some translation and were ready to pay for this kind of service. But it was really a terrible thing that for long years he was unable to find a job. And then when he got a job, of course, it was not at the level of his preparation because he had finished law school. But he was employed as just a very, very low, ranking clerk in some kind of a socialist industry complex. And he was, treated like an enemy of the people. He was being followed. Even his colleagues from the job were asked to give information on him. Our neighbors from the place where we lived were asked to inform on my parents. Many of their friends, unfortunately, I found in the files of the Securitate were betraying them. So this is another part of the tragedy. Sometimes I remember that my parents were talking to each other and they said, look, maybe this or the other friend, what if he's an informer? Said my mother, and my father said, no, 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 please, darling, don't say that. This is a sin, to suspect somebody. No, we don't have any proof. No, 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 just forget it. Don't think like this. And then it was my father's turn, to doubt about somebody. And then my mother would encourage him, no, 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 just forget it. No, it's not possible. This person is of absolute, he's absolutely trustworthy. You shouldn't doubt. And then I could, check that with the files. And everybody they ever suspected of was there as an informer. But there were at least, the same number of people which they never suspected and they were informing on them. So it was much uglier than they ever imagined. But it is also true that in the files you can find also the testimony of heroic acts, people who were, writing declarations that were defying the system. And we never knew about those acts. I mean, it was only God and this Securitate officer and the person who signed this. It was an aunt of mine who was really a hero. He was extraordinarily brave. Well, so there are also beautiful things, but it is a very difficult experience to go through the files of your parents.
Dr. Cherny, on a conversation we had a couple of days ago, you shared with me that your father and other prisoners in a prison, they would basically craft certain toys or like symbols of faith in prison using whatever was available. Would you like to share that a little bit of that?
Yes, for instance, my father has made for my mother a small, it's like a small medal made of bone, because the bone was being fished from the soup, and from this piece of bone and some pieces from a comb, which was dark. I mean, it was black, a black comb, and a white piece of bone. He made a small medal with the initials of the two, because my father's first name was Ioan, but he was called by the friends Niki, and my mother's first name was Elsa, but she was called Nina. So it's a medallion with the letter N to N, and on the other side that there is a cross, a small cross made from these pieces of the comb. And there are also other objects that are, treasured memories that my mother kept in some kind of a small box with the most important treasures that she had. She was keeping them. There's also a small angel made by some blankets of that prison. And my mother has made a small, like a puppet, like an angel, that she offered my grandmother, which was held in the same prison in another room. And for Christmas, my mother made this angel and gave it to my grandmother. It's a very, very small, like a doll, a small angel made from cloth. So yes, it is a small consolation. But the most impressive object that we have in this treasure treasure box is a letter that was sewed by my grandfather on a handkerchief, a message that he sent home through a friend who was brave enough to take it when he got home. He was released from prison, and he hid it in his coat, and it was impossible to find, if when he was searched. But it was anyway an act of courage. It was a very dangerous thing what he did, and it is a very, very precious message. This also shows his mindset. My grandfather was a very very well tempered person. He never lost control. He was also a very optimistic of nature, and everybody was happy when he was put in some prison room with other people. They were very happy because he was all the time laughing and making jokes, and he was raising the morale just by his presence. I remember him. He had a very, very special laughter. He was contagious. So these people, after all they have been through, you would expect them to be at least depressed when they remembered everything that happened. But actually, it was not the case, not at all. And one of the things that were funny in the files that I studied, the files from Securitate, was something that one neighbor informed the Securitate. This neighbor had promised the Securitate to inform them on anything that is suspicious that happens in our room, because it was some kind of a collective house. And this neighbor was able to listen to what was going on inside through the keyhole. And the most suspicious thing that she found, and she needed to report to the Securitate, was that there was a lot of laughter. So my parents were laughing. This is incredible, because they were just coming back from prison. Their house was ruined, and they had nothing to eat. They had no jobs, and they were laughing. So these people cannot understand that she was troubled by this thing. She thought it was very suspicious. Maybe they were up to something. Why were they laughing? They were preparing some coup or something. Why could they be optimistic? So this is something that this, the other side of the barricade never could understand. I think this brings us to some important thing that we stress. Later on, let's also speak about the Vișinescu trial, which took place a little more than 10 years ago. It started in 2013, and it was, I think it was ended in 2015. And Vișinescu was the head of this Râmnicu Sărat prison. He was one of the most notorious, the most sadistic torturers of the whole history of the prisons, communist prisons in Romania. And during this trial, there was a lot of media coverage, and my sister and I were very, actively participating in this trial. And we were asked by journalists about the things that my father and my grandfather had suffered in Râmnicu Sărat. And all the time they said, you are the daughter of a victim of Râmnicu Sărat, you are a daughter of granddaughter of a victim of Vișinescu, And that's something that we need to stress, that my parents were not victims. They won the battle. I mean, it's not about being a victim, because things didn't end that way. History showed that they were right, and their heroism was recognized. And many people, after Ceausescu fell, and then we had a little more freedom. We can talk about this freedom, but it was, of course, much more than we had before. Then his life and his testimony were accessible to other people, and they could influence their life choices and their orientation. So not only, of course, in spiritual terms, but also in political terms, they won. I mean, the victory was theirs. Romania now belongs to NATO. Romania is back in the civilized world. And now there is, room for us to continue fighting, which is more than we can ask. I mean, it's a God-given gift, and I think that we should be grateful for this victory, because the miracle was not only that they both came out of prison alive, which already is a miracle, but they came back without making any kind of compromise. I mean, this moral resistance was much more important, because the pressure was huge, the gigantic, and without the help of God and supernatural, grace, this is not something that you as a human can handle.
This is such an amazing testimony, Dr. Cherna. And thank you so much for being today, for being here, for sitting down with me and sharing. These are so, how would I say, so deep thoughts that you're sharing, and very personal stories that I want for others to hear as well, because we're only a generation away from from something like just happened in 1940s in Romania, 1945. We can never be comfortable look the other way, because the danger is always out there, and it's clear and present. And at the end of the day, it's a story about a triumph. Your father was a winner. He triumphed by himself against like the most brutal regime that was ever invented, the communist regime. Thank you very much. I hope that
Thank
I could
you.
get you back here on a show, because there was so much more that I wanted to talk to you about. Maybe with your permission, we could shoot for a second episode.
Thank you so much. Thank you.